describe music or painting or any other kind of art, except by comparison with something else that you might or might not know. So we're searching, aren't we, for descriptions which may possibly not be accurate, not be truthful. It makes things possibly eternally difficult, particularly I think in a culture where people possibly have less and less experience, go to galleries less, go to concerts less, so you're kind of adjudicating art in a quite strange way.
Okay.
Silence.
Thank you very much from my side as well. Very interesting, no doubt. I guess my question has to do with music and education. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to bring up the whole universities shutting down their music departments in the UK. So kind of like that's the first part. How do you feel about this, like composition education in the UK in particular, if it will be able to survive this, let's say? And also, what is your opinion about teaching composition on an educational level in the global scene of, as it is today, or how you see it happening in, like, I don't know, a few years from now, a decade from now or something? I would be very curious about your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball with me. I'm not that. I'm not a soothsayer, so I really can't predict what's going to happen. When I was working for the ISCM, I travelled once to Frankfurt for a conference when the BBC started dumbing down, which is to say they stopped high-level discussion and broadcasting of aesthetic viewpoints and so on, and replaced it with kind of gossip, basically, you know. And the move, I mean, it's 25 years or 30 years ago since the universities in England, anyway, started to change their angle, usually influenced by government reports, government funding, and so on and so forth. The universities have now become far more like employment exchanges than they have centres of learning. The emphasis is not learning the subject for its own sake. It's with a view to, can I get a job by doing this, which is placing the emphasis in a very different place to where it was before. I lament all of these things, and I'm very, very lucky that I managed to live through a period when learning for its own sake was still very much present. I retired from Southampton in 2018, so I'm not really very much in touch with what's going on now. What I observe is that it's kind of up to individual teachers within those institutions to maintain what standards and what levels of presentation of their subjects they can. I think it has probably always been like that, but there is obviously behind that an economic desperation, if you like, about how we finance things that are not immediately profitable. But whether this is an English topic or how it relates to the Lithuanian economy and culture, I'm not the right person to ask. I mean, British imperialism is still recovering from the shock of loss of empire. I don't think they're being very realistic about it. You can see that from the quality of our last parliament and possibly this present one as well. Things are in a sorry state. I'm 80 years old next year, so I'm not going to be around for that much longer, sadly. And as I say, I don't have a crystal ball to look at and say, yes, this is going to be the future. It's kind of up to you guys.
Okay, it looks like we are finished with the questions. So thank you very much. It was a great pleasure and honor to hear you and to hear your thoughts. And now we continue with the first session and presentation by Miloš Zatkalik.
I've done what I can, guys. Thank you for listening. And I wish you luck with the rest of the conference.
I just wanted to bring your attention that this year, 2025, there was a new CD of Michael Finnissy released called Complete Piano Works by pianist Ian Pace. And there is one physical copy for sale here, if you want. It is also available on all the streaming platforms and for digital purchases on iTunes, Amazon, and etc. So please check it out. And thank you, Michael. It was wonderful to have you.
Can I see? Okay. Yeah. Ready? This is microphone here or here? If you want to stand, you can make it like this. I'm afraid I have to sit if we are to hear anything because I need to operate this. Okay, so I'll do it like this. Okay, hello everyone. Nice to be here for what, 8th time, I believe. Anyhow, synthesis has never been a technical term in discourse about music, if we exclude electroacoustics. Outside of that realm, which at this occasion I'm not going to engage, we use the word occasionally and for various purposes. We use it much less commonly than its counterpart term analysis. Music analysis, an academic discipline. Analysis, not music synthesis. Is it because we take unity and integration for granted as a condition of possibility of any composition? Or perhaps, to put it crudely, it's easier to break up than put together. We see that in physics. We know how to harness the energy of nuclear fission. The much greater energy of fusion we can still only use to blow ourselves up. Yet synthesis is somehow destined to enter musical vocabulary. Dictionary definitions of synthesis in several languages mention the word composition. When we think about etymology, Latin componere, from com plus ponere, to put together. To compose means to put together some elements. To put various elements together is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for a musical composition. We not only put together, we put together to form a whole, a meaningful whole, an aesthetically satisfying whole. That is what the notion of synthesis must also include. The relative scarcity of the term and the lack of consistency in its use enables it to take on a plethora of meanings and areas of application. We analyze a piece of music, we break it down into its constituent elements, but we aim to show how the elements fit together to form a coherent whole. We analyze how the piece was synthesized. We can go beyond individual works. We talk about synthesis of different styles. We talk about syncretic forms of art that synthesize music with other types of expression, from ritual to opera to Gesamtkunstwerk. Then there is the following procedure, also synthetic in nature. Synthesis of two disparate materials into a new unified one. Works just well with Beethoven, for example. There are more problematic cases like Sinfonia by Luciano Berio or Schnittke's First Symphony or the Beatles' All You Need Is Love, and countless instances of forms like collage, medley, pastiche, or potpourri. Do we need to distinguish synthesis from coexistence or juxtaposition or superposition? But then these juxtapositions, collisions even, enable new concepts of meaning to arise. In film editing, that would be called montage. The concept originates with Eisenstein, who actually drew inspiration from music and believed it was applicable to all forms of art. If that qualifies as synthesis, then we could think about two basic types, one somehow built into the composition, the other construed by the listener, the composition ultimately being a kind of a higher order synthesis of these two syntheses. After these preliminaries, in the remainder of this talk, I will discuss the process of synthesis occurring within a composition from a perspective that has received less attention in music scholarship. Given the time frame, I will focus on one example. Hadedas, Presentation and Three Developments, a four-movement composition by the Serbian composer Srđan Hoffman. The first movement is presentation, although the true presentation is only this excerpt. Afterwards, it becomes as developmental as the subsequent movements, indeed more so than the third one, the second development, written in the form of theme and variations strongly redolent of chaconne. While definitely not a sonata allegro, the first movement at least presents some contrasting materials, subjects them to elaborate developments, and at certain points returns to them in their more recognizable forms. The third movement, with its variation form and slow tempo, easily qualifies as the inner slow movement in a typical four-movement cycle. Add to this partial recapitulation in the last movement, and we get something vaguely reminiscent of a sonata cycle as practiced in the 19th century, or at least a synthesis of movements of different characters. Let us, however, look at this example more closely. It contains pitch collections that seem to be just that, atonal pitch collections complete with Allen-Ford labels. But then the first chord belongs to the pentatonic collection, the primordial, one might say almost universal scale. We see these stacked perfect fourths, and while they are a subset of the pentatonic, they also carry certain associations in their own right. Now this second chord, pay attention to this, we recognize the harmonic series. Again, something elemental and primordial, and it comes with the bonus of having the pitch contact almost identical to Scriabin's Prometheus chord. Next, this 014 trichord is ubiquitous in post-tonal music, arguably the principal building block of a large portion of post-tonal repertoire. This is followed by the scale passage, which could be a generic conjunct motion, or could be an octatonic scale, again a favorite of any number of 20th century composers. There are even hints at functional tonality. I can give a schematic representation of these implications as follows. We won't go now into details about that, just to give you an idea how that works. With all these disparate elements combined to produce a new whole, we would have a textbook instance of synthesis, especially because all the cited implications are hardly recognizable. It is perceptually and semantically opaque, and it takes an analyst to disclose the synthesis. These connections refer to pre-existing constructs or to other composers or compositions, in other words, to something external to the composition itself. My emphasis now will be on the composition as an autonomous entity with its internal relations. Then the important thing would be to see how the initial events connect with whatever comes afterward. If these connections are a kind of synthesis, then we are ready to distinguish between a synthesis of elements pre-existing and independent from the given composition, including all the cultural baggage associated with the initial chords, and the synthesis of elements within a piece, respectively exo- and endosynthesis, as we might call them, with all due reserves we ought to hold regarding such clear-cut categorization. We'll return to the score and see a few examples of internal connections. The initial chords return, sometimes with vertical permutation of notes. The initial chords can be conceived of as combinations of two triads, and that property is extensively exploited throughout the piece. There is also pentatonicism, and as I said, vague tonal associations. Now that we have some idea about this composition, there are three types of processes that I wish to discuss: connection, disjunction, and conjunction. These terms and concepts are freely adopted from Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, especially their book Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. In Anti-Oedipus, syntheses relate to the political realm, to the realm of the socius, the production of social machines. But if they don't talk specifically about music, these concepts are abstract enough to function in many contexts. With that in mind, we can understand my previous examples of internal connections as the fundamental connective synthesis. Nothing can be produced without making connections. Tone connects to tone, chord to chord, motive to motive. These connections proliferate. We obtain an intricate network of intersecting connections, a degree of continuity, a network of structures with points of relative stability. This does not yet produce a composition, but some kind of entity of being is beginning to emerge. What matters the most here are the connecting lines, the intersections and inflections between them. As long as we are talking about connections, we tend to emphasize a smooth, continuous flow. But every process, far beyond the realm of music, also contains interruptions. There is tension and resistance, repulsion and rejection. New connections cut the previous ones. A handful of examples outside music. For any mechanical device to function, we need gears pushing against each other, an explosion to ignite an automobile engine. The contact between the moving parts creates friction. Or we may walk uniformly along a straight path, but we can make stops or change directions. For every society to function, there must be laws and norms, but included in that society are social movements that challenge the established order. In music, the flow can be smooth, but can also be interrupted by intrusion of a different material. The instruments rub against each other. A chord strikes us as particularly dissonant, whether or not the dissonance is resolved. Now we are talking about disjunctions. The cuts and interruptions can serve to mark relatively distinct regions or territories with specific functions. The principal logic of disjunction is either or. The initial chord is either an abstract pitch class set or a tonal function, or yet a pentatonic collection. However, we must beware of what Deleuze calls the illegitimate use of disjunction. The illegitimate would be if an analyst forces us to choose between these options. Instead, we recognized that disparate elements or actions still belong together. The disjunction is inclusive. Once certain recognizable, distinct processes are established, they can acquire a normative character. As the music unfolds, we encounter other processes, we assess them against the norm, and plausibly find them disjunctive. Beyond an individual composition, there can be disjunction between broader principles that the listener presupposes and uses to form expectations, and the actual music. Again, the legitimate disjunction is inclusive. Both the norm and deviations belong together, whether the norm be a priori or contextually established. All this still doesn't amount to a fully fledged composition, synthesized into a coherent process. The continuity of the connective and the disruption and differentiation of disjunctive synthesis need to be resolved into action. I talk about process and action rather than a stable entity in order to emphasize the dynamism of music as a flow. This conjunctive synthesis is not a reducing of all variety to a common denominator, nor separating it into clear categories. It is about creating a meaningful coherence while embracing differences. In addition, possibilities are open for new connections, for creating assemblages, like composition, performer, listener, society. The flow of music is initially produced through connections. Owing to disjunction, it is recorded as a distinct experience. These processes and the desire underpinning them are asubjective, pre-individual. The listening subject, one who can say, I listen to this, I enjoy, dislike, make sense of this music, is only produced by conjunctive synthesis alongside the creation of the composition. The concept of desire just mentioned is a huge topic with Deleuze and Guattari, but we cannot even begin to discuss this at this time. Instead, we will have a brief look how a certain analytic techniques engage with such issues. A Schenkerian graph aims to represent how certain elements are synthesized into phases of a process, and these phases into the process as a whole. to demonstrate connections between them, to recognize disjunctions, that is, dissonances and digressions, and integrate everything into a unity. In a Schenkerian graph, a higher level event synthesizes a number of lower level ones. This is the concept of Auskomponierung. I cannot claim this to be the case here. Yet a tentative attempt to do likewise with Hadedas would yield something like what you can see here. All obvious caveats aside, my graph could plausibly show a number of disparate elements interconnected. It assembles differences in a productive way. It could possibly enable us to weave together, synthesize, different threads into the musical fabric. It could suggest a kind of process. It is even weakly teleological. It visually presents at least a possible way in which we make sense of this music. So, things connected, friction created, resolved into a determined action. Connective, disjunctive, conjunctive synthesis. It certainly reminds us of the dialectic triad, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Some parallels must be drawn. First, it is important not to confuse this with the great thinkers, Hegel and Marx. I'm saying this because you can actually find certain vulgarizations in musicological literature. Now, Beethoven was a revolutionary, therefore, for obvious reason, not a Marxist, a Hegelian. Accordingly, the first two movements of his Fifth Symphony are thesis and antithesis, the finale being, of course, a synthesis. But alas, there is this third movement. Well, Beethoven invented a pre-synthetic area to prepare for the grand triumphant synthesis. So you can still fit the symphony into the straitjacket of the dialectic triad, and if this smacks of violating the sacrosanct schema of a vulgarized Marxism, well, it is somehow sanctioned by Beethoven's genius. Certainly this is going too far, but let us look again at our two graphs. Let me see. Okay. Schenker, like now, the Hegel of music, against my Deleuze-inspired dialectics. He takes tonality as a transcendental condition for any music worthy of that name. We do not. His graphs are totalizing. They tend to iron out differences. Deleuze would call this an illegitimate use of synthesis. I would rather think of my graphs as showing connections and pathways and producing a whole only alongside it. In Schenker, the end is known in advance. Our graphs suggest the same possibility, but does not entail a necessity. Where the Hegelian synthesis yields an at least temporarily stable entity, Deleuzian synthesis resolve into action. Where a Hegelian sees the labor of the negative, Deleuze affirms difference. If I mention the resolution, it doesn't mean subsuming contradiction under a unity. The process is one of constantly varying intensities and perpetual becoming. We may be, somewhat paradoxically, be closer to Adorno's negative dialectics, or perhaps Heideggerian strife between Welt and Erde, world and earth. But neither of them substitutes affirmation and multiplicity for negations and contradictions the way Deleuze does. Having said this, there is still something conspicuously missing. Following the Deleuzian line of thinking, we can assert that the listening subject is the product of synthesis. There is no transcendental subject who then listens to music. But once the subject is synthesized, they synthesize the listening experience. Obviously, experience can only unfold in time. Deleuze offers us his three syntheses of time. But there is no way I can synthesize more time for this presentation, so here is where I need to stop.
Thank you, Miloš, as always, for your inspiring presentation. Yes, we have to give questions. I wouldn't, but what is kind of requirement of a conference? So I wanted to ask, what do you think? Do these Deleuzian categories are applicable to all kinds of music? I mean, categories which describe kinds of synthesis, connective synthesis. And if we take a piece of Mozart, for example, could we analyze in a similar way?
Very simply. Does Mozart's music can be heard as flowing smoothly with many elements connecting between each other? I believe definitely does. Do we hear interruptions and dissonances? Of course we do. Of course. Does it somehow add up to a process which also then involves the listener who, together with the notes themselves, with the conception of the performer, with all cultural context, everything, produces some kind of music? It does. So it can work very well. Of course, how strong these junctions will be, of course, in let's say, in an expressionistic composition, certainly more than in Palestrina, but there's still sometimes some of these elements may be minimized. In a moment form, for instance, this final conjunctive synthesis may be somewhat downplayed, but we still need somehow to make sense of the composition as a whole. We tend to do that. It may be even contrary to the composer's intentions, but I don't pay too much attention to what composers wanted to achieve. It's something that the human mind usually tends to do to somehow connect things, to make patterns. So actually, to some degree, it is bound to exist everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one more comment or question. What do you think about phenomenological perspective? Because phenomenologists, they discuss synthesis. Because synthesis always happens in the process of cognition. When we listen to the music, and you said that concept of synthesis is very rarely applied to analysis is rather applied. So synthesis always features in phenomenology, kind of active synthesis, passive synthesis, and it happens everywhere. And actually even Deleuze's concepts could be easily related to phenomenological insights.
To that point, it absolutely perfectly fits here. There is one crucial difference that, at least talking about Husserlian perspective, there is always this transcendental ego who is first, who is always presupposed, from Descartes' cogito through, and that's something that actually Deleuze dismantles. Whether we agree with him or not, it's a different matter, but this kind of perspective that there is no subject who then listens to music, but the listening subject is created through these processes. Okay. So,
It's
otherwise,
very hard to dismantle transcendental ego, I have to say. And it seems that Deleuze sometimes he lacks arguments, actually. And phenomenologists would not agree with such analysis, because everything what you do here, it is kind of something about experiences, something what transcendental ego does. And you did also in your...
Deleuze would say experience precedes. There is first experience, that is, actually he would call that transcendental empiricism. And the subject is only created through these experiences.
Of course, I understand your point as well, but it's nice to have such discussions, such kind of creative, I don't know, frictions or so.
Disjunctions.
Yes. Synthesis, which is, how it is called? Disjunctive, yes. Okay, thank you very much, Miloš, for your insightful presentation.
Thank you, dear Miloš. Also from my side, that was an excellent presentation. And I have a very simple but maybe universal question to you. How would you define synthesis in the context of musical analysis, respective music theory?
I'm not sure that I heard you well, but it is between how it's music analysis and music theory.
I think you gave excellent examples of using tonal analytical techniques, the Schrenkerian graphs, in the context of post-tonal music.
Yeah.
That was very interesting. Is this a kind of synthesis in your opinion, or how would you define synthesis in the field of musical analysis?
Okay, how do I define synthesis in musical analysis? Well, obviously, analysis is in its most rudimentary form, or in the most rudimentary sense of the word, it's the opposite of synthesis. Okay. But we do that in order to expose the way it is synthesized. Not necessarily. I mean, you don't have to presuppose a coherent whole. You may want to analyze a piece in order to dismantle the unity. It is possible. But given what most analytical techniques and their theoretical underpinnings we're doing all the way up till sometime after World War II, hundreds of years back. It was usually about how everything fits into coherence. Set theory does that. I mean, how to find an underlying unity. Formal analysis, you analyze a sonata form, and then you say, okay, the first and the second the themes are related in such and such a way, and then belong together. The thematic process of Rudolf Reti, for example, who phonetically wants to see thematic connections, everywhere. So most of the time, analysis was concerned with how everything fits together. That means how everything is synthesized.
Thanks a lot.
Yes, more questions, comments? Okay, so thank you. Thank you, Miloš. And now we continue with the next presentation by Paulo Gambacinni from the National University of the Arts in Argentina. His paper is titled Function, Tension and Emotion, a New Approach to Harmonic Analysis and Composition. You're welcome.
It's taking over. It won't let me create. Can it go down with this thing? Excuse me. Can you help me drag down the screen?
Oh, okay.
Because it's rebelling.
Okay, maybe.
If not, this is new.
Wait, how do we do this? Like, what? Turn on that AI.
Is the photo of the AI?
Yeah, I have no idea how to. Maybe. No.
Extend.
Yeah, no, I don't know.
You can move this one.
But I can move that one.
Okay, this is one is more. Maybe.
So, can you maybe play from that? What if you just. Let's do.
Problem is,
Can we not like.
yes, I just have to do full screen.
Yeah.
No, I assistant not.
What about double tapping?
No,
Okay, this is.
let's do something intelligent.
It's Control L.
Yeah?
Okay, that's great. Okay. Hello, everybody, and I'm very grateful to have been invited to this conference. I will take some very basic levels of harmony now. We went to very avant-garde things. I'm going to go to very basic things. So, tensional release. Is that all there is? Is this the most we can say about an harmonic relationship? Why and how is a perfect cadence different from a plagal cadence? What do they evoke? How can we say that the dominant and the subdominant are just different levels of harmonic tension when their relationship to the tonic chord are the intervallic opposite? How can we talk about chromatic relationships other than just saying they are common, uncommon, far away, or close? This work will try to address these questions and more from an empirical point of view, focusing on the listener's experience. To test this model, I am working with a small sample of participants. Further investigations will be needed to get a standardized statistical analysis of the model in practice. This work will cite historical uses of harmony in order to get an expressive emotional context, but won't draw its conclusions from analyzing recurring patterns in musical literature. The majority of chord progressions that exist, excluding the triton and the unison one, have an intervallic opposite. Every opposite relationship in music should have an opposite effect on the listener. If we begin by describing what kind of response a listener has to a perfect cadence, we could describe it as conclusive, clear, young, or attracting. We know that the plagal cadence is the intervallic opposite of the perfect cadence, and that the typical response the listener has could be described as inconclusive, unclear, yin, or repelling. The perfect cadence has historically been used as an assertion to represent triumph after a battle, for example, as it happens in military marches. The subdominant instead has historically been used to represent acceptance, as it happens in the Amen, a positive acceptance, or in the funeral march, a negative acceptance. What it is interesting to note is that this attracting repelling quality doesn't change if we change the mode of the chord involved. A minor fifth chord going to a minor first chord will continue to be perceived as a resolving function, but in a different way. And the same goes for every permutation of modal interchange of these progressions. 5-1 will continue to sound resolving, and 4-1 will continue to sound unresolving. This happens because of the intervallic relationship between their fundamental tones doesn't change, and because it continues to be significant as it is invertible. What I have just said is common knowledge. Even if we don't use these expressions constantly, we have a general idea of these expressive characteristics. But then the question is, how does every other chord relate to a determined tonic following this logic? Before expanding our understanding to more complex relationships, we have to get an idea of how to create a tonic feeling. in the shortest possible time in order to avoid possible contaminations to the experiment, adding other factors to the equation more than just the progression itself. The way I tested all these chord progressions was by using what are called converging progressions, x to y to x, in order to create what I call a tonal frame, using the rule of 3 from pattern recognition theory in order to create a baseline. As we all know, chords have meaning inside a determined context. In a complex environment, form becomes essential in order to get a sense of this meaning. The listener tends to determine the tonic of a piece not only by its harmonic content, scales and chords, but also by its formal organization, beginnings, endings, and durations. This is how we can say a work is in Mixolydian mode and not in Ionian mode, for example. The scales are indifferent from each other, but the discords tend to gravitate around a determined scale. Gravitation usually means beginning, ending, or staying more time on a determined degree or chord. This principle is essential in order to test the chord's intervallic relationships, as it helps us in order to get a clearer grip of the meaning of the progression by stating a point of stability or arrival set up by the frame. Testing these relationships becomes ambivalent when we just use two chords, as we lose sight of the context. We don't know which chord is the resolution of the progression. If we use just C to F, for example, it could be analyzed as tonic to subdominant or dominant to tonic. We don't have a discursive context. Instead, if we do C to F to C, we can get a better grasp of the relationship between the F chord and the C chord in a context where the C chord is the main character, as the music revolves around it. For the unison and the tritone, I will have to make a parenthesis, as these are the only two intervals that don't have an inversion, but nonetheless they are not neutral. What I have found out from testing these intervals is that, as they don't have a clear direction, the only factor that makes one or the other feel more resolved is the mode of the chord. In the unison progression, the minor to major feels more resolving than the major to minor. As it happens usually in music tradition, it's much more common to end the piece in a major mode than the other way around. The tritonal relationship feels attracting when the tritonal chord is major and repelling when the chord is in minor mode, indistinctly from the mode of the tonic chord. There could be an explanation for this phenomenon if we look at this kind of relationships in a just intonation lattice. In that case, the tritonal relationship would be less ambivalent because a tritone up is a different note than a tritone down. If we look at the results from these experiments, we end up with the question of what's its logic, what kind of model or tone organization can explain it, represent it. After seeing different kinds of tonal organizations, I realized that a just intonation lattice can help us navigate these attracting-repelling relationships, but with a little caveat. For those unfamiliar, the just intonation lattice organizes tones based on multiplications and divisions of a fundamental tone by the ratios of the perfect fifth by 3 and the major third by 5, generating overtonal frequencies, those that are multiplied, and undertonal frequencies, those that are divided. As we can see, if we remain in a symmetric just intonation lattice and try to find the chords more close to our tonic, we will see that all the undertonal chords are attracting, except for one, the subdominant, and all the overtonal chords are repelling, except for one, the dominant. It almost looks like a yin-yang, finding one point of the opposite category on its side and having an equilibrium point in the middle. This kind of organization can maybe explain why the major tritonal relationship is attracting, as the closest tritonal relationship is undertonal, and why the minor relationship is repelling, as the closest minor tritonal relationship is overtonal. The same happens with the unison. The major-minor relationship would be overtonal to undertonal, and the minor to major would be undertonal to overtonal, which is attracting. Another interesting tone organization model that we can look into that fits into the way attracting and repelling relationships relates is the diatonic circle of fifths and its inversion. The circle of fifths in a diatonic scale is not perfect like a chromatic one, as it has a tritone inside. If we project this kind of circle of fifths and its inversion simultaneously, we get all the attracting degrees on one side and all the repelling degrees on the other one. We can also fit the tritonal degrees as triton substitutions for the tritonal leaves in the progression and get the same distribution as the jazz intonation lattice. Now that we have found out how each chord progression works in an attractive repelling dynamic, we can ask ourselves, but what is the difference between each one of these progressions to the others in the same group? Why don't we use tritonal relationships as a dominant instead of a fifth degree? What's the difference? How does our perception change from one progression to another? Here we enter the territory of chromatic tension, which is similar to the concept of chromatic distance, but applied to the attracting-repelling scheme. Every time we get farther away chromatically from the tonic chord, the relationship feels weirder, more extreme, more otherworldly. But it is less clear functionally. We continue to feel the ascending fourth progression as well as the descending minor second progression as an attractive progression to the target tonic chord. But the ascending fourth is perceived more as a clear, boring one, and the descending minor second is perceived more as an unclear, enthusiastic one. We can say that functional clarity and chromatic tension are opposite forces. The more the functional clarity, the less the chromatic tension. The more the chromatic tension, the less the functional clarity. Neither characteristic ever fades. Our ears can perceive both at different levels. We perceive the descending minor second progression more for its chromatic tension than its function. It feels full of energy. And we perceive the ascending fourth progression more for its function than its tension. It feels clearer, more rhetoric. In this chart, a positive degree of functionality corresponds to an attractive quality, and a negative degree of functionality corresponds to a repelling quality. But then, how can we use this notion to analyze and compose? Knowing what kind of relationship every chord provokes can be a very useful instrument for analyzing and constructing chord progressions, be it chord by chord for cadences at the end of a phrase, and in order to understand how a modulating harmonic plan balances in a longer form. For example, in a, let's see if this works. No, it's not important. Well, in a 1 to 4 to 5 to 1 progression, we can see that 1 to 4 is attracting, 4 to 5 is attracting, and 5 to 1 is attracting. So we can say that this progression is really clear and functional. It feels resolved. Instead, if we look at, now it doesn't want to work. Okay. If we look at 1 to 5 to 6 to 4 progression and back, we can see that 1 is repelling to 5, 5 is attracting to 6, 6 is repelling to 4, and 4 is repelling to 1. The typical pop progression is clearly more of a floaty one, which doesn't imply it's a wrong thing, but it is a desired characteristic. It's what distinguishes a more impressionistic feeling from a more classical one, a more sublime style versus a more concise one. Another important factor to take into account about these progressions in order to measure their attracting repelling characteristics is form. The last relationship, the cadence, is usually the most significant in order to determine if a phrase feels more or less resolved, and in which way. In looped music, like pop music, the turn, the relationship between the last chord and the repetition of the first one, is usually the most important part of the progression. This concept can help composers choose progressions that follow or avoid an attracting tendency. If we want our music to feel more floating, we should aim to use more repelling relationships. Or if we want it to feel more affirmating, we should aim to use a more attracting scheme of progressions. Composers use this kind of relationships without thinking about it in these terms. For example, in film music, using the Lydian roll, which is the first degree to the second major degree to the first degree, F to G to F, is usually used to musicalize flying scenes. It's a repelling progressions used for flight. In the next examples, we can see how to track function related to a tonic in a longer form. This kind of analysis is still experimental and requires a bit of nuance in order to determine function and chromatic distance, because not all the chords we analyze are major or minor. I, for example, chose to classify full diminished chords as having the fundamental of the dominant chord they are replacing in a determined context, and half diminished chords as having their own root note as the fundamental. Chromatic distance is determined by the implied tonality at each moment and the distance of it from the tonic of the piece. Comparing the prelude by Bach and the Clair de Lune by Debussy, we can see that Bach is more balanced in relation to attracting or repelling function, while Debussy is a bit more leaned to the repelling side, making its music a bit more floaty. Debussy's piece is clearly more chromatic, going further away in chromatic distance. The next example, as it's an analysis of the tonalities of a piece, becomes easier to analyze, as you can only have major or minor tonalities, so the functions are more clear. Special attention is paid to pedal tones. In this example, the pedal tone is classified as the dominant function, and when the tonal content in the upper voices is from the tonic chord, the tonal distance is 0, so it is a place with maximum tonal function and minimal tonal distance. As we can see, the more dramatic tonal relationships of the piece are in the first half, and it tends to get more stable in the second half. The middle point of the piece is marked by the dominant pedal, which serves to stabilize the harmonic function before the reexposition. Chromatic tensions can help us measure how shocking or smooth a progression is, and can also help us in order to analyze how a harmonic narrative balances out on the long run. For example, if we analyze the next progression, 1 to Neapolitan 5 to first, we get that from the first degree to the Neapolitan, as it is an ascending minor second, it has a repelling characteristics, so it gets a -5 level of chromatic tension. From the Neapolitan second to the fifth degree, we get an attracting progression, which has a +5 level of chromatic tension, and from the 5 to 1, another attracting progression, it has just a +1 level of chromatic tension. By this analysis, we can see that there is a dramatic peak when we pass to the Neapolitan chord and to the 5 degree, and that most of the relationships are attracting, so we could say that this is a concise and a bit dramatic progression. The next graph shows us how chromatic tension and major minor modes show in a longer form. We can see how contrastingly different is the Bach prelude to the Clair de Lune by Debussy, being the Bach prelude less chromatically tense and more stable at the level of mode, while Debussy's piece uses more extreme relationships, provoking major chromatic tensions and a more chiaroscuro effect in the ever-changing modality of the chords used. This kind of analysis is especially useful to analyze tonalities and modulations, as it gives a clearer view of the narrative arch. It is interesting to see how in the Ballstein example, we get this intense beginning and relaxation by the end at the level of chromatic tension. But we also get these two symmetrically opposite peaks, this one here and this one there, before the middle and near the end of the piece. If we look at the modes used, we get that 60% of the piece is in major mode and 40% is in minor mode, which is still a very equal narrow relationship for being it a major sonata. But how does this theory relate to the emotional world? I use for this the Russell's circumplex model of affection or emotion, which is a psychological model developed by James Russell that represents emotional states on a two-dimensional plane, organized in a circular pattern. The two core dimensions are balance, representing the pleasantness or displeasure of the emotion, a pleasure-displeasure continuum, and arousal, representing the intensity of energy level of the emotion, a high-low intensity continuum. Emotions are mapped in this circular space, allowing for the depiction of the relationships with opposite emotions located 180 degrees apart and unrelated emotions situating 90 degrees apart. If we can take Russell's circumplex model and trace a parallel between the concepts of attracting progressions to the concept of activation or arousal by following the idea that with a higher degree of chromatic tension in the attracting territory, we get a higher level of arousal or activation. And we can trace a parallel between the concept of repelling progressions to the concept of deactivation by increasing the level of deactivation as we increase the level of chromatic tension in the repelling territory. Balance can be linked directly to the major-minor characteristics of the chords. This puts all the major chord progressions in the positive balance territory and all the minor progressions in the negative balance territory. In order to test the emotional response of each chord related to a tonic, I made use of monomodal convergent progressions. This is done in order to avoid having mixed signals for balance between context and content. By doing this, we get some more extreme and odd progressions, which help us get a clear response. This work won't deal with mixed relationships between frame and content, as it would require much more testing and exceeds the scope of this seminal work. What I can say, though, is that if you look at the musical literature, balance is a complicated subject. There is usually an ambivalent relationship between the degrees balance and the tonal frames balance. To give an example, historically, the Neapolitan second chord was used to depict the other world or death. And I think that even though the chord is major, the context being minor makes the classical listener opt for the minor interpretation of this progression. So it would be interpreted to be in the area of fear instead of the area of excitement. This just talks about the way sensibility changes in different historical periods. When music was less chromatic, the emotional interpretation was more nuanced and context-based. When music became more chromatic, the emotional effect on the listener became more literal or direct. We could extrapolate direct relationships from the circumplex model to each type of chord progression, but it is not the idea of this work. We could do it, I've done it, you can see. But the idea it is to put back the idea on the table, to follow with the emotional turn in modern philosophy, by enriching the way we analyze music by filling it with meaning. This model can help guide composition and improve oral skills, as well as developing a more nuanced emotional language for how we describe music, a piece of music. It should work more as an invitation to self-analysis in order to understand how oneself perceive emotion in harmony. The model helps by giving a frame and new words to enrich our vocabulary. We can disagree on the specific emotion a determined chord degree provokes, but we can place it in a very similar area of the circumplex model of emotions, agreeing on its level of arousal and balance, and that by itself is a nice step forward to shared emotional meaning. What I have found out by testing this model is that the problem with emotions and harmony is not so much about subjectivity or intersubjectivity, but that the task itself is a rather challenging one. People tend to feel similar things but find it very difficult to articulate them in a differentiated vocabulary. The problem lies in the sensorial characteristic of music and the cognitive processes required to articulate emotion. Other than balance, each level of emotional nuance becomes really different to differentiate. One thing, though, that is interesting to note is that even though the majority of these progressions are very rare, the repelling chromatic progressions are more rare than the attracting chromatic progressions. And the same happens in emotion and spoken language. Low arousal emotions tend to be less differentiated as we have less words to describe them, and high arousal emotions tend to be more differentiated as we have more words to describe them more precisely. Well, thank you for your attention. I hope this presentation was interesting for you. If you have any questions.
Thank you very much. Time for questions, comments.
That was really something very, very interesting, this sort of correlation. I think the obvious question would be, are there any experimental confirmations or refutations of this? These sort of investigations, how people emotionally react, it's been done countless of times. but I'm not aware of anything like this.
No,
To correlate specific emotions to specific harmonic progressions is something quite new. Is there any experimental research
if there are
in exactly that what we are seeing on this slide?
I am doing them now. I haven't finished the experimental phase. This is the proposal. I have searched for, how do we say, previous experimentation by other people, and I haven't found this level of granular, let's say, investigation. I have found a study that studies modulation, but modulation requires much more quantity of chords. This is much more atomized and to the point. So, in general, I didn't find other studies that are doing this, and I'm working on it now.
That would be interesting. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. I just want to say one remark that such investigations, it reminds quite a lot intentions of theoreticians of Baroque.
Yes,
I mean rhetorical figures, intentions to classify them and to ascribe certain emotional meanings. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it could be some references to them as well. But my fundamental question, why do you do that? Why it is interesting for you? Is it really possible to give such a formalistic interpretation to emotions and to musical functions? Because it looks actually such investigation too formalistic. It hardly convinces your comparisons, I mean, of modulations and this spectrum of emotions. Yeah.
What's the question?
Yeah, which is rather common. Why do you do that? Why it looks interesting for you?
I have two levels of interest in this. The first one was before the emotions, and that's I have a problem with how tonal harmony is usually taught. Like what I said, that we get different levels of tension for opposite type of relationships. That's the first problem I have with the way tonality is explained. So that's the first part of interest. I see a lot of studies, and in general in modern music, we are very focused on the vertical constitution of harmony, let's say complexity. We are very interested on tonal pitch class set and series. But I didn't see much study of what it is expanded tonality, the horizontal axis of tonality, let's say. So when I studied harmony in the university and I reached like to the fourth level of harmony, we studied mediant progressions. They didn't have any idea of function in mediality. So the first interest, the basis of interest of this study is to get a functional analysis in the chromatic space in a syntactic way, other than just saying dominant and subdominant, more tense, less tense. I'm proposing that instead of thinking as subdominant as a thing inferior to the dominant, that's the classical approach, no? I'm saying that subdominant feeling and all the chords that relate to the subdominant are really another universe, and give us a different way of approaching this. What I see in general with tonal analysis is that when they try to apply it to pop music, for example, they don't have any more words to use. They say Radiohead is unanalyzable. With this kind of analysis, I say, no, it's not unanalyzable. It's just using opposite relationships. That's the first thing. The part of the emotion, it was an overreach I did. I am interested. In fact, today we don't have time, but I also had some examples of film music, for example, where we get more direct chromatic examples that are very on your face of the use of emotion. What I was trying to convey when I'm talking about chromatic tension and emotion was the relationship between arousal and chromatic tension. So that's why I say this is an approximation, but it is interesting to see for emotionally charged music, like it's film music, that you have to convey the emotion of the scene, you get an interesting use of this kind of relationship. It gets very close to the how do you say, to the diagram I am presenting.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I probably never used tonal harmony in my entire career, but this is the most fascinating thing about tonal harmony for me, how each kind of chord can represent some kind of different feeling, different emotion. And when listening to your presentation, I started wondering, how about our learned experience? How does it affect this? Is the harmonic progression of, let's say, Mahler or Wagner understood the same way by us in the 21st century as it is by some of the Wagner's contemporaries? Because, like Ramunas mentioned, the rhetorical figures of Baroque, some of them work quite well today. Mm-hmm. Some of them are completely obsolete, and the same goes with more chromatic harmony, like you said, like jazz harmony. Mm-hmm. It's so dense, it's so complex, and it feels like it's kind of pointless to pinpoint exact function of this, and maybe just use the region if it's dominant, if it's subdominant, if it's like increasing the tension, if it's releasing it. So yeah, what about the difference in time? Do we perceive it the same?
Yes. Also, not only in time. It's interesting to see it also in level of how do we say, education. I've been testing people that don't have any formal education, and I'm surprised about them that they get like, no, this is attracting, this is repelling. They get it very clear. At least that part is very, very clear, which I am myself amazed. At the level of emotion, as I said, I think, especially in the territory of balance, is a very different thing from the past to now, because we are now used, as in everything in our culture, that everything is very literal. We get the image, we get the material thing, and if you look at literature of the past, the way they wrote literature, the way they spoke, it was much more nuanced and much more metaphorical. So yes, it definitely changes through time. As we change as expressive beings, we are becoming a little bit simpler now. So this is a simplification of a simplification.
Thank you, thank you.
I'm keep being intrigued by this relating the specific effects to specific. I must say there is a problem. I mean, there is no question we react emotionally to music. That's it. But what is really what accounts for the powerful emotional effect of music is not this. It is something which goes developmentally earlier to the unconscious pre-verbal effects. Danielson called them vitality effects. for which he uses terms like we cannot find words, they are preverbal.
Yes.
Music helps discharge this, and it is very psychologically important, even physically important. But the word he uses to explain them or to describe them are, explosive, bursting. He uses even in words crescendo and decrescendo, things like that. These are not feelings as listed here.
Oh, yes.
We of course, we can react in that way. That's all right, but it doesn't explain the way music emotionally moves us. It goes to this unconscious preverbal layer of our psyche, and that's why I'm a bit skeptical where would this specific thing lead us.
So
it would be very interesting to find out, but
no, what you are saying is not wrong, but it's also in Russell's theory. It's comprised because what you are talking about and what we are talking about are different levels of perception and different levels of constructing perception. So what you were talking about was about the visual stuff of music, the precognitive part, isn't it? Well, in the Russell example, what it talks is about activation and activation, the feeling of tension, the feeling of distension. The next step he does is to categorize language in this way. He gives people to categorize each emotion as a different level of tension or distension. The thing is that, yes, these are different levels of cognition. We all get the amygdala part, which is the basic instinct, and then we differentiate or are not able to differentiate to differentiated emotion. And that's what I said. It's difficult to translate music to differentiated emotion, but I think it's an interesting task to do, to enrich ourselves as also when we compose and when we listen, because you start to differentiate also what you listen. I work with kids, for example, and I ask them, okay, what does this make you feel? And they are like, they don't have the words to express it. So you start giving them options. Well, it's happy or sad. Well, it's clearly happy. It's in major mode. and that way. So yes, they have this visual reaction to music, and they are not able to differentiate it. But it's just a level of cognitive process that's normal in psychology, in neurology.
Okay, one more question. The last one.
Yeah, first of all, it's a great work, but I just want to add up a little bit to this topic and maybe to defend of this topic also, because I'm also analyzing emotions in music, and this semester particularly I'm trying to separate the types of expression in musical language, including the harmony. This chart that we have here, this scheme, this circle of emotions is actually used also by Juslin or Spitzer, where they also analyze these emotional processes. And basically what, not like lacks of it, you're maybe, of course, talking about it, but to add up that how a person understands it, basically, and why all of these emotion and music theories go on a similar thing, that it's described through action tendencies. And what we see here is a very classified quartz, let's say, which could be the base, but why I think someone in the audience also could have a problem is just understanding that this is a very good base, and the emotional process of understanding it, and also in a musical composition, usually works already through the process. So going through these basically affect type of different activation fields. So this is one thing. Other thing is that Usually the tension, harmonic tension, although it is very, very important and one of the most important maybe things, it works in a complex of other musical language elements. That's why sometimes you can't objectify completely just harmonic progressions. Because if you look at compositions, what you can see, for example, in Earl King, it's described as a motion of fear, and I'm analyzing by the same text different composer compositions. And what we can see is that sometimes we can even use the musical language or the harmony, very consonant harmony, while trying to perceive an actually completely opposite emotion. So it also in the context, it's also in the complex of other musical elements. But what I can confirm, at least from my also research, that these things are actually pretty accurate because you can see them used as a tendency through different composers, even when they use, for example, the same text. So just
Yes, thank you. Yes, I also saw some studies that they are very nice. They are using data analysis to see what type of chord is used to what type of word in a song, and they get similar results like this. That's word painting, and clearly, every level of complexity you add to composition will reinforce or negate the thing you are saying. So I am just working with plain harmony, no rhythm, no nothing, just chords that goes to chords. But that's the beauty of music, is that you add rhythm and you can get a complete different emotion. You add pitch. You can also have complex emotions. I didn't touch because this is an infinite subject, but for example, like he was saying, jazz, when you use a complex chord, you get a mixture of emotions. It's as this conference is, it's a synthesis, a new feeling that's complex and much more difficult to differentiate. But that's the thing. I am trying to go back to the most simple type of relationship in the most simple environment. Because, as I said, I see a lot of work that have to do with the vertical complexity, but I didn't see it about the horizontal complexity. And I'm just talking 2 chords. I haven't seen anything like that. Every type of work I've seen starts with 4 chords. It starts with a cadence. It starts with rhetoric, how do I say, rhetoric figures. And I have never seen anyone talk about the Neapolitan minor second or the minor flat 3 degree, and they are used, but they are not talked about. So that's why I'm interested in this zone of analysis.
Okay, so thank you once again for a very interesting presentation, for a nice discussion as well. Now we have a coffee break, and we will continue at 12:30.
Weeks, guests, so we will continue with our conference and our next session starts. So my honor to be a moderator. And the next speaker is Darius Kučinskas from Kaunas University of Technology. And his presentation about creating a universal language of arts. Čiurlionis vision, please. Tanas. Oh, sorry, Darius.
Yes. Hello. Hello. Yes, this year, as we know, Lithuania celebrates 150 years of our most famous composer and painter, Miloš Konstantinas Čiurlionis, and I decided to do a presentation about his composition process maybe, and about his efforts to find something universal to express his ideas in music, in art, in painting, in graphic, and other sides. Well, Čiurlionis, well, maybe, yes, few slides. As we know, Čiurlionis lived very shortly, 35.5 years, and he was a professional musician. He finished the music academy in Warsaw, then in Leipzig, then he finished art school in Warsaw, but his creative process continued very short, about 10 years in music and about 7 years in art. But his creative heritage is quite impressive, about 400 music compositions, including drafts and unfinished music, about 300 paintings, several literal poems and texts, and few poems and critical articles. Well, speaking about universal principles of artistic expression, Čiurlionis lived in the beginning of the 20th century, and he was, of course, influenced by synthesis of arts, by symbolism, and he wished to find something universal which combine different kinds of art. And according to research of his creative process, according to research of manuscripts, it was clear that Čiurlionis tried to do that under interaction of arts via structural similarities, first of all, structural similarities, usage of symmetry and plane isometries, and implementation of archetypical forms like circle, triangle, and square. What was the reason for this? First of all, of course, the time when he lived. Then it was the personal reason. He was a highly sensitive person. The multinational and multilingual surrounding where he lived, the use of cryptograms for secret correspondence, it was also related with the political situation in that time, and also Čiurlionis observed universal principles for interrelation of arts. Personal features, he was really a very sensitive person. He had absolute pitch, he had a feature of synesthesia, and was very curiosity in different fields, for example, in psychology, in astronomy, in geology, and that influenced his creative process. Well, he lived in Druskininkai, in the place where 3 provinces were on the corner, Vilnius, Gardina, Suvalkai. It was very interesting that there were 2 calendars used in the same time, Julian and Gregorian. And people living in Druskininkai and in Vilnius spoke in various different languages, Polish, Russian, Jewish, Lithuanian. According official statistical in Vilnius in 1897, you see the structure of the society. It was very multinational society. And of course, it was influenced by Čiurlionis, well, Čiurlionis, first of all, tried to use some secret writing or cryptograms or hidden writing to correspondence with his family. And in one letter of 1905, he really described that these letters, for example, corresponds to some symbols. And in one letter, he wrote this message. What it means? It means that this is an alphabet of Čiurlionis family, used by father, me, you, Stasys, Petras, Jonas, their brothers. Good night, dear Povils. It's from the letter of to the brother Povils, who lived in the United States for that time. So, first of all, Čiurlionis tried to create some secret codes to correspondence for sending information. And this, for example, coded signature I found in the manuscript which is still in the United States. And for the first impression, it was nothing. It was some strange symbols, but after inserting letters, we see that it is a signature, Čiurlionis. Another code was formed for musical expression. In one notebook, I found also ABC with a correspondence with some artificially created musical signs, notes and other signs. And in other book, it was a music composition, like 3 bars, 1904, 1905. This is quite interesting composition. Well, if we speak about that time, it's totally atonal music before Schoenberg, but it was not a composition. It was really only translation from verbal language to musical language using this special code. It's a little sad that Čiurlionis was not following this method because it was a door to a new field, open age. Well, another method he used from the Middle Ages, when we select only letters which correspond to the notes, and he formed the series, for example, sequences of notes. And these sequences of 7, 9 notes were used like a background for music variations, for composition. If in this variation we see 9 notes repeated each by each, and with different direction, different rhythmic pattern, so we can listen to an example. Sequences. Another variation, cycle of variations, was very interesting because Čiurlionis used the series as much times as it was notes. 7 times he used from the next note. An example in music looks like that. Okay, it's archival recording of Vytautas Landsbergis. Not very good. But the structure of this variation is like a palindrome with a super serie inside in a red color. So it's efforts to implement maybe some structures from visual art. And decorative code we found in the graphical work, where only about 10 years ago, musicologist Rima Povilionienė decided to decipher these ornaments, and after some efforts, she decided that it is written some words. So verbal language is transformed into ornamental decorative code, which means Zosinka jedyna in Polish, or Sophie the only one. And there are still undeciphered scripts, which waits for your efforts to decipher this. What is very interesting in connection between music and visual art, that Čiurlionis tried, first of all, he used verbal symbols, verbal letters, and he tried to implement them to find similarities and parallels in musical science and in visual expression. For example, his sketches, painted sketches, looks like letters, like key, like L and other letters. And of course, natural sign he tried to transform into letter key, which means the first letter of his name. And some graphical forms he used from music into painting in a distance of 10 years. And according to Dorothea Eberlein, German musicologist, she discovered that Čiurlionis used in parallel some maybe structural elements in his painting and music. But more close links between music and painting, it was discovered in comparison with two cycles, cycle of painting the sparks and cycle musical variations What there are, it's the structural lines of musical line repeated in the paintings. But most interesting maybe discovering was when I tried to understood why this poem used, it's a literal poem, why Čiurlionis used few words so often, in which sequence it was used. I selected this, I catched these words, put in one row, and what happened, it is a musical structure in two parts. So literal poem was composed like a, written like a musical structure, of course with a symmetry. And symmetry is another feature which Čiurlionis was tried to implement in his music very often. For example, he composed one prelude of 1909 where the left hand really was formed according to two types of symmetry. Vertical symmetry, it is mirror symmetry, and shift symmetry. An example looks like that. Listening music, we cannot recognize that elements, that structures. But really it's composed according to the symmetries. Well, another example, when he formed the texture, he used the same notes, same direction, but in different time. Well, in paintings, of course, it was also symmetry. In his paintings of that year's symmetry was used very often. We can see and recognize vertical symmetry, rotational symmetry. And according to Vladimir Fedotov, a Russian musicologist, we can also understand his paintings like a musical composition, like a musical structure. And he tried to compose, he tried to implement musical form structures into painting and visual structures into music. So this one example, another example like a sonata form with a recapitulation. But maybe most interesting is, well, the sonata, other sonata, the fugue. The title is Fuga, Prelude and Fuga, and the Fuga is really composed and formed. The visual picture is according to musical structure where we can identify maybe 4 voices and 2 themes. It's very interesting that in exposition there are like, well, 2 different themes, and in the recapitulation, the second theme only dominating. Well, how visual forms and structures were implemented in music? Together with Kevin Holm-Hudson from the United States, we discovered that Čiurlionis really used some background for in sixth. And this background really is based on the C note, and we can identify that there are like a triangle used in musical structure. Another form, like a circle, was used in the prelude A minor, where the bass line was shifting note by note, and after going all the octave, the prelude finishes. So we can understand, according to the circle of fifths, that it is like a really expression of the circle. There are some strange structures, I cannot say what they mean, but the structure appears when we cut the rhythmical melody of rhythm of right hand of the melody, and putting vertically, we see that they use also symmetry. The music looks like that. Sometimes it happens by accident. It was only progression with instrumentation, but not a conscious efforts to form like a tree, because it's only. Well, and speaking about the last period, 1910, when the last painting was painted, here we can see that really Čiurlionis summarized really his efforts to combine these elements. He tried to find archetypical structures like a triangle, sphere, and maybe square or cube, and to implement that in painting, in music, and in graphical works, his graphical art. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Darius, for your informative presentation, which revealed some aspects we didn't know, even Lithuanians. So I also think that maybe for foreigners who do not know Čiurlionis so well, it was also kind of informative presentation. So it's time for questions, for comments, please.
Of course, it's difficult to...
Miloš, maybe you, as always. It would be so nice if you...
Well, perhaps this is only tangential to your presentation, but it's rather interesting and actually very significant. The fact that a number of artists, particularly musicians, were very inclined towards this cryptographic approach to languages. Think of some of Mozart's letters, but if you have access to a complete edition, not something which is edited and selected, he did amazing things with language. He treated his sentences very often like kind of variations. Or Leonardo da Vinci, who would write backwards from right to left, which is the same thing that my composition professor back in Belgrade used to do sometimes. He also enjoyed it. And you find many examples like that. Yeah. Tendency, and even writers who are widely recognized as attempting to musicalize their fiction do that kind of thing with language. James Joyce is a paramount example. Nobody has pushed music, literature toward music to the extent that he did. And he had hilarious combinations of in Ulysses and, of course, Finnegan's Wake. Probably this this individual development from, I'll be using Freudian distinction, from this primary process thinking to secondary process involves from this transition from basically oral representation of the world through visual to verbal and conceptual. Tendency to sort of reach with a verbal conceptual apparatus towards this unconscious and pre-verbal, reflecting the need to do something with language which somehow desemanticizes it and makes it semantically opaque. And I don't know, I mean, I'm just rambling my ideas, but inspired by your presentation, definitely.
Yes, the method is not new, of course, not a new method when we can use letters, for example, instead of notes, yes. But what is quite new and very original that it was based for the background of the old structure of composition. And this composition really is formed like like one structure based on archetypical forms, not only on letters, not only on verbal language, but when he finished the music studies and started to paint, he discovered that there are some universal elements which combines, which unifies different kinds of art. And he tried to express, maybe he tried to form like a vocabulary, like a ABC to understanding. When we listening music, we can see forms, or when we see forms, we can listen some music. But it's, of course, it's not a finished work, but yeah.
And it's probably no accident that he did a very big step towards defiguralizing painting, towards abstraction.
Yes.
Yes,
it was quite brave steps, but it was interrupted by his life, early death, and so on.
Yeah. Great. Right.
Some more questions, comments?
Thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. On the other hand, I think Čiurlionis seemed to predict the future. He invented techniques that remind me of the early 20th century or even later decades of the 20th century, like composing with rows, probably with pitch glass sets, with so-called pitch glass sets. And also these symmetrical rhythms remind me of concepts by Messiaen. Do you think that he might have been an inspirational source for famous, even more famous composers?
Yes, really, the situation with Čiurlionis is very strange because he really did not live and did not act in big cities like Vienna, Paris, Berlin, or other. He was really outside of the cities. He was quite alone, closed, and worked with himself. But he knew what happening in Europe because he was visiting Dresden, München, also Vienna for one time, and he understood that, and he wrote in a letter to his brother that Europe really is going somewhere to discover something new, but it's still in the how to say, not finding the way where to go. Europe is refusing the previous methods of composing and art expression, but not found another ways. And Čiurlionis really tried on the same way, like Schoenberg, like Kandinsky, like other composers. He was on the same way, but worked individually. And only now, after some time, after decades, we can recognize some similarities and the results, what he reached. Yes.
It's a fascinating thing. He was earlier with some concepts than Schoenberg.
Yes, he was maybe proto-surrealism or like that, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure whether we have some more time for questions. It seems it's hardly possible. Okay, so let's proceed. And thank you. The next speaker is waiting online, and let me to present him, Austin Ottinghar. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing his name properly, but he's from Michigan State University. And the presentation is called Toward the Purest Possible Synthesis, Interdisciplinary and Transmediation as Principles for Composition in Hermann Hesse's Glass Bead Game. Yes, looking forwards, Austin. Okay, some technical problems soon they will be solved.
Can you talk a little bit? We do not get sound from you. We do not get sound from you. Can you check your inputs?
Is it possible to access him somehow?
Yes. Okay, okay, wait.
Can't hear me?
Okay. Yeah, here we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
You can hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
And you can see my screen?
Yeah.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay. So it's good to start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you to the committee for inviting me to this talk, Principles of Music Composing. My name is Austin Oettinger from Michigan State University. The title of this talk is Toward the Purest Possible Synthesis, Interdisciplinarity and Transmediation as Principles for Music Composition in Hermann Hesse's famous novel, The Glass Bead Game. So I'll be talking about this novel by the famous author Hermann Hesse. This novel received a special citation when he received the Nobel Prize in Literature. Unlike typical composers' work with this novel, however, I'll be not talking about the story as an extra musical source for writing program music. Famous example in this direction is the 1997 Pulitzer Prize nominated Horn Concerto by James Beckle. Instead, I'll be going in a very different direction, examining the game itself, a fictional game that's played by characters in this novel, and the rules and styles of playing this game for potential insights, specifically for current discourse on transmediation, which ties into the concepts of interdisciplinarity and synthesis. In this way, my work is more in alignment with Enno von Ferk's research, also with the game itself, not the story, the rules and styles of playing this game in his work for insights into the practice of cultural psychology. What is transmediation? Transmediation essentially is reappropriating a science system from one medium to another. So in the example from John Cage that I'll be talking about, reappropriating the physical spacings between rocks in a Zen garden into intervallic spaces between pitches. And scholars nowadays talk about transmediation in 3 dimensions: sensory, semiotic, and signal, which I'll be talking about in detail. This figure here is taken from one of my recent papers, which was published in Organized Sound. And some of the ideas I'll be talking about today, I've been thinking about in recent months and had some feedback from in my last conference presentation just last month. I myself have read this novel twice. I'm currently reading through it for the 3rd time with a focus on the game itself, its rules and styles of playing. Just a bit about the book itself. So again, it's a fictional game played by characters in this novel who become masters at this game. And according to Hesse's very detailed descriptions of this fictional game and its fictional history, it's closely allied with the practice of music and proceeds according to musical and mathematical rules. He likens this in his early part of the novel to a Bach fugue, and also the notation of the game itself to musical notation. This was later taken over by mathematicians, then philologists, visual artists, architects, and so on. With regards to the pedagogical path of the characters in this novel, a lot of them become initiated into the game through music, actually. And for the main character, the protagonist called Joseph Knecht, this came about through this character called the Music Master. He was a very influential figure in his education from his primary and high school, secondary, to the equivalent of his university years and beyond, making sure that his studies weren't too one-sided. So besides his education in music, also education in Greek and maths and so on. An important part of the studies of characters is this period called the 3 years or the 3 studies, which is corresponding to our postgraduate years. And in this period of time, students are encouraged to study widely. And the main character, he spends these years learning maths, a couple of years learning Chinese and Chinese philosophy, and also this scale, this theory of the correspondence between scale of colors and musical keys. The important takeaway from this is that Hess encourages this concept of interdisciplinary virtuosity, which has been identified as one of 5 new conceptions of virtuosity by Linda Jankowska. In her words, this has to do with multidimensional skills, autodidactism, collaboration, and co-creation. It's in alignment with the traditional concept of excellence in technique and expansion of human possibilities in virtuosity, such as we see with Paganini, for instance, with his expansion of violin composition and performance. As I've been saying, Hess likens the practice of the game to music performance and composition very closely throughout the novel. And as a consequence of that, he does discuss the concept of virtuosity at several points throughout the novel. One thing that he is very strongly about is that this is opposed to the traditional concept of virtuosity with respect to showmanship and bravado, which we see in certain periods of music, so to speak. And in his words, this is a kind of empty virtuosity. So not showing off, basically, all these possible connections between disciplines, which I'll be talking about shortly. And we see this interdisciplinary virtuosity in 4 of the composers that I'll be talking about today. Cage, Juozas, Grise, and Čiurlionis. We see, for instance, in Čiurlionis, after his studies in music, feeling the urge to undertake studies in painting for a period of time. Cage had a very self-directed educational path, from being a theology major to contemporary art, music, even the study of mushrooms. Grise, with how he explained his vision for spectral music, using terms from science and mathematics such as entropy, decay, and crystallization. And Juozas, who is a professor emeritus at University of California, San Diego, and also was a self-taught composer. So this leads into the main part of my talk, which is about transmediation and potential insights that this fictional game from this novel by Hermann Hesse can give for current discourse on transmediation, especially this framework for transmediation, which was recently published in 2023. So transmediation, what is this? So this term was coined in 1970 by a film professor called Rod Whittaker. And in his original usage, this was to translate a stage play into film. So from the medium of a stage play to the medium of film. On the other hand, the Glass Bead Game was published about 30 years before that, in 1943. And according to the translators of the Glass Bead Game, this is an act of mental synthesis, a symbol of the human imagination, not a monopoly of the mind, so to speak. So the important takeaway here is that before the term transmediation and before the Glass Bead Game was published, composers such as Čiurlionis and before him have been exploring this kind of interdisciplinary, intercultural synthesis in their artistic works. This concept of transmediation has undergone refinement in the years since. Translation of ideas from one medium to another. So with Čiurlionis, as we'll see, painting to music and music to painting, vice versa. Translation of content from one science system into another. And the definition which I think is most important for us as composers to think about, the content plane of the original science system is projected onto the expression plane of the new science system. Music being an expressive, performing art form with an expanding scope for expression nowadays. And as I mentioned, scholars talk about transmediation in 3 dimensions today. First dimension is sensory, and this is going from or to one sense to another. So music visualization, a very common form of oral to visual transmediation nowadays. Second dimension is semiotic, and this is the most important, truest to the essence of transmediation. This is reappropriating a science system from one media to another. So the example of the physical spacings between rocks to intervallic spacings between pitch, which I'll be talking about shortly. And thirdly, signal transmediation. And this is information transfer from one form to another. So for example, organic natural movements, which might be captured on analog film, which might be converted once more into digital samples. How does this relate to the rules and the styles of playing the glass bead game? So early in the novel, Hess defines the rules as being a sign language and grammar through which the interrelationships between the content and conclusions of nearly all disciplines can be expressed and established, which is very similar to the definitions of transmediation that I've just discussed, especially translating the content from one science system into another. Important aspect of this sign language of the game is that it's ideographic. It's a pictorial stream of associations, which Hess likens to Chinese. So this character, Jian in Chinese or Ma in Japanese here, visually, this actually depicts sunlight seeping through the crevice of a doorway. And this is the way that we should understand the sign language of the glass bead game. It's this way of open pictorial associations that the game's players make these interrelationships between different disciplines, and how we as composers can resonate with bringing elements and structural principles from other mediums such as painting into musical compositions and structures. One such example here is this sheet music by John Cage, where the physical spacings between rocks in this Japanese garden is converted into intervallic spaces between pitches. In his words, he also transmediates the tactile, so the physical touch, the presence of the garden sand, into the oral dimension with an instrument representing that through a scraping sound. Working with another Zen garden is the Australian sound artist, composer Michael Fowler. He also worked with the physical spacings between rocks in this particular garden, and in his work, reappropriating that into the physical space between speakers in his multi-channel installation. Unlike Cage, he also works with signal transmediation. Here, where he captured the organic natural sounds from different parts of this particular garden into digital ambisonics recordings, which he then processed also with live coding. From Japan is Ryoji Ikeda, probably Japan's leading audiovisual artist today. His work is sometimes characterized as data art, and in this particular piece that I'll be talking about, Test Pattern, he engages with the principles of transmediation. On the sensory side, so visual data is made audible, and on the semiotic dimension, the most compelling and important dimension of his work, these sometimes overlooked and opaque patterns and systems that we're enmeshed with in our everyday lives, especially on our iPhones, the email texts and photos and so on. Those systems and patterns are brought into the audible and the visible in his installations. Technically speaking, according to the current framework of transmediation, he is not working with signal transmediation, however, because he's still working within digital information from email texts and then converting that into the binary zeros and ones, which they're constituted of. Čiurlionis, unlike the other composers I've been talking about so far, he moves in both directions in sensory transmediation, from visual to oral and oral to visual. He would alternatively paint a picture and write a composition. A good case study in this area is his Sonata of the Sea paintings and Mario's The Sea piano music, both series created in 1908 and both having the same musical names, for instance, Allegro, Andante, and Finale. This painting here, Sonata of the Sea Allegro, if we just have a look at this, I'll play for you just an excerpt of De Mario's The Sea Allegro movement as well. So scholars have identified this correspondence between physical space and line in his paintings with interval and melody line in his music. So physical space corresponding to intervallic space, and that's very much what John Cage did with the physical spacings between rocks to intervallic spaces between pitches. Next composer, Juozas, also working with visual art and converting that into music. Here he was working with this engraving by Kamai, which is also informed by topological principles, something that Juozas was very much influenced by. For this piece, for white noise on 6-track tape machine called Icon, on the source of white noise. Topology is the mathematical study of continual transformations of physical objects. So, for instance, a plate or a ball, which might be stretched or bent without breaking, is topologically equivalent to the original form that it was in. And this has a very nice correspondence to the technique of analog filtering, especially pitch band or bandpass filtering of white noise. Last composer is Gerard Grisey, and in this important work of his, translated as The Black of the Star, he worked with this important astronomical discovery, I believe, in the 1960s, of Vela pulsar signals from this distant star. And I believe they pulse at a rate of something between 1.3 to 1.6 seconds apart, something like that. And he converted this into musical rhythms and tempi in his piece, which was for 6 percussionists in a circle around the audience in the star-like position of being orbited around, just like in this photograph here. And according to the biographer of his recent biography, they believe that he would not recognize versions of this composition without the full audiovisual experience, such as seen in this photo here. So this leads into the recommendations that I'm making for current discourse on transmediation, specifically that framework for transmediation, which was published in 2023. One common comment about transmediation is that there's a degree of subjectivity. What scope of subjectivity should we allow composers in picking out elements from a medium and using them in certain ways in music? So we see, for example, with John Cage picking out the sand of the Zen garden and using that as a musical element, whereas Michael Fowler picked out natural sounds from different parts of the garden and used that as an element of his composition. So what I propose perhaps considering for this current discourse is this distinction between legitimate and subjective associations that Hess makes in the glass bead game. He calls subjective associations with respect to the private nature of an experience. So in the novel, the main character, he has a very powerful personal experience when experiencing the smell of a rose, and that forms a very strong association in his mind. That's something that can be communicated to other people and understood, but it's subjective, private by nature, not universally graspable. And as a consequence, it cannot be used in the glass bead game or transmediation by consequence. Another interesting example here is synesthesia, which, for example, is hearing colors or seeing sounds, sound-color associations. And artists such as Čiurlionis did have this condition where they have this very strong correlation between sounds and colors. For Čiurlionis, there might be a very defined link between a certain color and a certain tone or sound. But this is different for other artists and other composers, you know, who have synesthesia. They might have a different association between this particular color and this particular sound. Therefore, it's subjective and therefore not allowed for sensory transmediation. On the other hand, Hess talks about legitimate associations. And this is something that in the novel undergoes, kind of like in academia, a peer review process. There's a formal review process for recognizing what he calls legitimate associations between different disciplines. And so if we apply this to transmediation and practice of composition, especially in music, we've seen, you know, two composers who have transmediated a Zen rock garden to music. Perhaps if enough composers do this, and enough of them recognize certain musical associations as legitimate, or even, you know, just learned composer scholars, you know, studying these works and recognizing these as legitimate musical associations, such as the ones with John Cage and Michael Fowler. What I'm suggesting here is that it's discipline specific. So disciplines such as rock garden painting, music, you know, very specific kinds of structures and traditions and scopes for associations. And secondly, that is culturally responsive. So what is legitimate is not only what is accepted in the dominant musical culture. My second recommendation is also some terms from Hess's novel. And here he talks about logical, cosmic, and individual kinds of synthesis. Important thing here is that they're not mutually exclusive. There's overlaps, different degrees and dimensions of these three kinds of synthesis. This is a very nice, succinct definition of transmediation here. It's a conceptual synthesis of separate media rather than assemblage or transformation at the expressive or material level. Here, this is something that's important, I think, for composers to consider, with music being an expressive performing art form, rather than, you know, just a conceptual synthesis of separate media, where unity is perceived and variety is manifest. So with transmediation, just by the nature of transmediation, this is something that's not only, you know, explored by composers in music, but other mediums, as I've discussed. Just by the nature of transmediation, it stresses the logical or formal and individual kinds of synthesis. Individual, as we've seen, there's that degree of subjectivity in composers selecting which parameters and how they'll use those parameters to create as compelling a musical experience as possible. With the logical or formal kind of synthesis, Hess talks about this early in the novel with regards to Hegelian thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And this is about the beauty of conceptual unity, such as that definition I just shared, and the beauty of formal relationships rather than a material or expressive kind of synthesis. This is also culturally specific. For example, symmetry is something that's, formal symmetry is something that's beautiful in ancient Greece, but would not be considered beautiful in traditional Japan, for example. There's a third kind of synthesis, which Hesse talks about, which is the psychological or cosmic kind of synthesis. This is a style or mode of playing the game, as he puts it, and this has to do with contemplation and meditation, in his words, on each stage of the game's progression in order to facilitate a mystical experience. So this is unlike the logical or formal kind of synthesis. This is emphasized on the expressive, process-based experience of playing the music, of creating music. We do see overlaps and combinations of these three kinds of synthesis in composers. Čiurlionis, we see a synthesis between the intuitive and the intellectual, so logical. Individual also with his sound color synesthesia. And some scholars have identified this cosmic dimension of his work, especially with regards to the experience of time. This nice quote here, similarly to the experience of time from the present into eternity, like we see in Dante and William Blake. My third and last recommendation that I'm presenting here is perhaps having finer distinctions between different forms of signal transmediation, especially analog and digital information. So what I shared earlier with Ikeda in his work, technically speaking, according to the current framework, he's not working with signal transmediation because he's still working within just digital realm of information, digital emails, photos, converting that into the binary number chains. Likewise with Juozas and analog painting into analog tape processing. Hesse does talk about this in the Glass Speed game. This interpretation here by Timothy Leary, the idea that you can convert any Ford or number into binary chains as an ultimate database of ideas. So perhaps we can have distinctions between different kinds of digital, different kinds of analog information. Just a summary of some of the similarities and potential contributions between transmediation and the Glass Speed game here. And some of my citations. And thank you for listening to this talk, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Austin, for your insightful presentation, in which we can see certain outline of theory of transmediation, even. And thank you also for your wide scope, including so many composers and theories around. So it's time for questions, comments.
Hi, Austin. Thank you very much for very interesting presentation. And I don't know if I can express myself cohesively because there's so many things on my mind right now. And the idea of transmediation, I think it's very closely linked to what Michael Finnissy was talking about, transcription. And it is a subject of interpretation, of selection of some key aspects that are important for a composer from the other field that he's referring to. And I have a hard time agreeing with legitimate and illegitimate things, as they are all subjective. There is no objectivity in it, and otherwise, it's a very fascinating novel. I haven't read it, and I definitely am putting this on my reading list. But yeah, I have this kind of problem with legitimacy and illegitimacy, and if you denounce that, this table of yours with organic, analog, and digital should have should turn, I think, into a like three-dimensional object with all the subjective transmediations that are possible in virtually any kind of from any kind of medium. So I don't know. It's not a question, but just a comment.
Thank you. Yes, I remember in one point in the novel, the music master saying to the main character, everything can be interpreted. So pretty much what you were saying just then. And yeah, the distinction between those kinds of associations, that's something that happens in the game. I'm, not, how do I say, I'm not enforcing, this distinction, for transmediation. I'm just making a comment, that some others have made as well, about transmediation, and that's just inherently has that scope for subjectivity. So yeah, that's something, which I think, is important to be discussed and in a conference context like this, and something which, in this particular work by Hess, it's just something useful to consider, and whether that's actually applicable for musical composition as opposed to this fictional literary device in his novel, But I do think, maybe there is some insights, just for the practice of peer review that he raises in his framework of legitimate and subjective associations. Just that process of, having a community of musicians and composers who do understand and recognize, these as associations, between music and painting, for instance, as we've seen with Čiurlionis' work, which we would recognize as legitimate. So hopefully that answers your question. These are things which I'm still working through, and yeah, just to reiterate, this is a fictional literary device, which Hess has proposed in this novel, and we're just considering its possibilities for transmediation, especially with regards to music. Transmediation originally, was about adapting a stage play to film in the original usage, but this conceptual framework only came about in 2023, and perhaps there's room for more specific discussion with musical composition and the subjectivity that perhaps should be afforded, as opposed to maybe some other disciplines.
Yeah, thank you very much, Austin, for your comprehensive comment. I would like to ask a question, but unfortunately we don't have time for that because our speakers are waiting. And thank you very much for joining our conference and for your insightful paper. Now the next speaker is also waiting online, and let me to present Murray Robertson from Northwestern University in Evanston, USA, and his paper is called Subtractive Synthesis and Semantic Sound. Field recording as a powerful creative tool in contemporary music. So hello, Murray, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Looking
Lovely.
forward.
Yes, can you see my screen as well?
Yes, sure.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you for having me to this conference. I'm very excited. My name is Murray Robertson. I'm a master's student at Northwestern, and my presentation title is Subtractive Synthesis and Semantic Sound. So I'd like to start by discussing field recording from the perspective of Aaron Einbahn's writing on subtractive synthesis. In his chapter in this book, Noise in and as Music, Einbahn rethinks the usual definition of subtractive synthesis with a more metaphorical application. So usually, subtractive synthesis is referring to a process of shaping a sound by applying filters to remove certain parts of the frequency spectrum. But Einbahn is writing that in a more abstract sense, any act of filtering a small piece out of a larger complex source counts as subtractive synthesis. He refers to this abstraction as the source filter model, and he describes many different artistic practices, like a DJ acting as a curator of a bin of records, filtering it down for the audience, or the artist Ai Weiwei's piece Beijing, the Second Ring and the Third Ring, in which he combines short clips of videos taken on highway bridges And the active filtering there is because he's taking this from an archive of footage only used by traffic engineers usually, and using it for art. And while Einborn does not discuss it in depth, he does refer to field recording specifically as a practice which is considered subtractive. It's taking small pieces from a larger source, using the start and stop button of the recording device and the microphones as well to frame a sound from the real world into a recorded form. Einborn's model also allows us to consider a field recording any sort of recorded sound, which is framing a real-world scenario. This definition is inclusive of most types of recording. Even like studio quality recordings, typically not thought of as field recordings, are technically framing the real-world scenario of whatever was happening inside of the studio. Whether out in the world or in a quiet studio, individual recordings that aren't using things like overdubbing or other like production techniques, they can all be considered like a window from which we can see the real world, inside of that audio recording. So where does the term semantic sound come into all of this? The field recording, the film theorist Michel Chion has his 3 types of listening. And the second of those 3 types of listening is called semantic listening. And the film composer and sound designer Luca Fagnini talks about Chion's idea and actually just says, this term, semantic sound. And he says that any sound that is semantic has a message to be interpreted. And while Chion's focus on semantic sound has to do with elements of film like dialogue, sound itself is particularly effective in communicating information like place and space. So Stephen Feld talks about how this communication works in what he calls acoustomology, which is kind of a strange anthropological field that he comes up with. But Feld states in his book, Senses of Place, acoustomology means that as a sensual space-time, the experience of place potentially can always be grounded in an acoustic dimension. Embedding a sense of place into a soundscape or composition goes beyond methods like just adding reverb to imitate a large space or a reverberant space. Field recordings have the power to communicate directly to an audience specific places, which include elements of soundscape. And for example, these would be like Armory Schaefer's keynote sounds or sound marks, which are particular sound objects that tell a listener, you are here, you might be here. And it's important to distinct that there are elements of spaces like reverberations and resonance, but elements of place are almost always regarding specific geographic locations. So field recordings are filled with semantic information about different places, words, language, and even though these recordings, when they're used in music, they're super semantically rich, they're filled with semantics, this depends on a listener's ability to recognize what is trying to be communicated and also to interpret the information present. And the reason that these are separate is based on this philosopher, Louise M. Antony's, her idea. And she describes this idea as the difference between meaning and the knowledge of meaning. She writes in her article, Meaning and Semantic Knowledge, about the many schools of thought regarding the relationship between these two things. But she iterates that, regardless of the relationship between meaning and knowledge of meaning, the psychology, how things are interpreted, the emotional reaction, is entirely separate from the knowledge of the meaning. So you can recognize something, and that is not dependent on how you will interpret it. Or I should say, how you interpret it is not dependent on recognizing this thing. So when we listen to a field recording in a piece of music, I may recognize what's going on. That does not necessarily say that I will interpret that sound in one way or another. For us as creators and composers, this distinction is key because the interpretation, when we're working with an expressive form like music, it is the interpretation of the audience which will most closely be our goal to manipulate. So from Einborn's idea that a field recording captures sound by filtering from the real world, and the fact that sounds carry semantic information, both linguistic or otherwise, this allows us to apply Antony's line of reasoning and say that when a listener recognizes a sound and then interprets it, a multifaceted relationship is established. This relationship extends from the listener all the way back to the original source, a piece of the real world that was recorded. The effect of this is extremely varied and flexible, and it depends on the listener's semantic knowledge and the musical composition itself. However, this flexibility makes it an extremely powerful tool for composing, not just with sound in an acousmatic sense, but with sound as semantic information. So I'd like to briefly listen to some 3 examples from 3 pieces, and all of these pieces use field recording in them and have a very interesting characteristic of semantics through them. So our first piece by Annika Sokolovsky is called So Much More, and it's recorded by the Acropolis Reed Quintet, and it's featuring mostly language-based semantic information. The tape is comprised of interviews with small business owners in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm going to very quickly make sure that I'm sharing my sound. Okay, wonderful.
My business is an online store.
Hi. So, my name is Kay Willing. My name is April Anderson. I'm Sabrina Swain. Hi, my name is Bruce. Hi. My name is Kay Willing.
Hi. My name is Garnet Archer. I'm second generation owner of Joe's Gallery here on the Livernois Avenue of Fashion, and we have been.
In 2016, I received a message from one of my customers. Her name's Kat. She wrote, "Hi Kiki, I have a leukemia and I only have a few weeks left. I'm 17. And I love your wigs a lot."
Alongside the actual semantics of language, the actual, the words that are being spoken by these people in these tapes, the voices themselves are also very important. Through the field recording, the composer here, Annika Sokolovsky, is able to kind of embed not just the words of a person, but sort of the person themselves into the musical composition. And that, I think, greatly affects the emotional resonance of the piece. And we see this, too, in For Ruth by Anea Lockwood. This is a great example also of a great deal of emotional resonance, but it also interestingly highlights the fact that a listener must have the semantic knowledge of what's going on. And so this piece is unique because I think that it is most powerful when you have the program notes, or in this case, it's the liner notes on the CD. But the liner notes are actually providing the semantic knowledge necessary for someone to create that sort of a relationship with not just the sound itself, but what the sound means.
Oh, that's very nice.
Oh, that's cool. I like to be a bit.
And I got a letter from you.
Really?
Yes, I did. Very happy. Shall I answer your letter? How are you this morning?
This album, Tête-à-Tête, was released in honor of Ruth Anderson, Anea Lockwood's life partner, passing on, which I think, I'm not entirely sure that this piece was commissioned for that album, but it is definitely a very powerful message, just in and of itself, and then listening to the music again creates a lot of emotional resonance. The last piece I have, Places of Sounds and Words by Henrik Helstenius, is perhaps the most abstract in concept. He is out of the 3, he is the only European composer. And he is composing with field recordings and an acoustic ensemble here in a way that creates a very unnerving sense of space, almost an uncomfortable listening experience. And I think that that's very important to recognize that the emotional power is not just this sort of stereotypical cliche, warm emotional resonance that someone in the audience might say, "Oh, this is great. I'm having a wonderful emotional, this is making me feel so good." This is not one of those pieces. It does not necessarily make you feel very warm inside. But the fact that Helstenius is able to use certain sound objects in field recording to create not just a space, but this sort of strange atmosphere demonstrates the power of the field recording's semantic information to contribute to the aesthetic of music. Just in case the audio is not clear enough, I want to sort of describe the second excerpt there. The acoustic ensemble is playing, and the tape in that moment is appears to be clips from what it would be like an emergency call for like a domestic violence situation. And my first impression upon hearing this piece, which was actually in a composition lesson, as funny as that is, it's very striking, and I don't think that has to necessarily do with the tone of the voice of the person in the recording, as much as it has to do with these sort of other semantic details, things that tell us, oh, it's a phone call, things that tell us how the person is feeling, how this sort of situation is going on. There's swearing happening in the background. And musically, I feel that that's extremely important to the aesthetic of the piece. Out of this whole piece is 7 movements, and this one is placed right in the middle of the form. And you can see from the excerpt from movement 2 that the whole structure of this piece is not necessarily extremely dense the way that the 4th movement is in terms of emotional semantic content. So, starting with this idea from Aaron Einbond that, a field recording is a piece of the real world. It has been synthesized subtractively from the real world, and kind of going through these ideas from Michel Chion about listeners listening to semantics, and Luis Antony's idea that once you have the semantic knowledge necessary to recognize something, you can emotionally resonate with it. We can create this sort of route that goes all the way from the listener listening to a piece of music back to the original space and place or time that this is sort of existing in. And we can think of this like collage, where a composer has the ability to take all these different little pieces of the real world and embed them into a sonic landscape. I think in a much more powerful way than visual collage sometimes. And while I want to avoid, at least because we're at a conference and this is music composition as an academic endeavor, I want to avoid placing merit on emotional reaction. I don't want to sit here and say, okay, this piece of music is good because it elicits this emotional reaction. Rather, I want to make a point that the psychology behind the listening experience is what is being manipulated by field recording. And the same way that electroacoustic composers are so focused on manipulating parameters within music, this is just another parameter that we now have at our disposal because of the ability to embed semantic information, not just acousmatic information, into our compositions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Murray, for sharing your insights and for very clear presentation and for presenting us composers, which we didn't know. So it's time for questions and comments. So may I ask first question? Do you work yourself with field recordings and have some competences in it? And
yeah, my composition itself has lately been focusing on field recording, and part of the work that I do here at Northwestern is not necessarily in music, but in sound design. And I feel that one of the very interesting things about doing sound design for interactive media, installations, video games, things like that, is that the ambience is very important, and it communicates a lot to someone who is interacting with something. And I have done myself lots of compositions using field recordings. And I think that's where the interest comes from, but yes, I do work with field recordings in my music, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Murray, for a very interesting presentation. I would argue with Ramūnas that some of these composers are quite known, at least for me. I studied with Henrik Elstenius.
Yeah.
So I'm really pleased to hear his music here. My question is, these field recordings, they transmit the semantic message to the music, but how is it related to the musical material and its development? How does it impact the structural processes of the piece?
I think that with Enea Lockwood's piece, that's an example where the field recording is sort of the structural foundation, and she has this nature field recording that it goes for the whole 9 minutes of the piece, and then there are these interspersed sound objects that I would argue are field recordings. They come from phone calls between Ruth and Enea, I think from the 1970s, and those field recordings are less ambient sound objects, but the way in which the structure is sort of created there is that you have this relationship between the specific place in which the nature field recording was taken, and then you have that relating itself to the semantic information of the conversation and sort of the emotional or aesthetic implication behind the words from the conversations. And then with a piece like Henrik's, you have, I think that his music is complex enough that it would require me to do a more in-depth analysis. I have to admit, I did not do a super in-depth analysis of these three pieces. I was mainly looking for examples in which the semantic content of the field recording affects the aesthetic of the piece or is able to very clearly and very efficiently manipulate some musical parameter. In Henrik's case, I think that parameter is space, and space less in a physical sense and more so space in a musical, experiential sense. I apologize. It's early in the morning here in Chicago, and so I'm trying to think. Let me know if I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to talk about a little bit about this definition of subtractive synthesis. If we sort of generalize it, could it be that any process of composing is then subtractive synthesis, because out of all possibilities, we definitely must subtract some of them because we can never use them all. So it is always some kind of selection is actually subtraction from the pool of all possibilities.
Absolutely. Aaron Einbaum would agree with you too. At least I guess I shouldn't speak for him, but his writing would say so. The core of his article, field recording is something that's only briefly mentioned in his article as one method, and so that's why I wanted to elaborate on that. But the core of his writing on subtractive synthesis is that absolutely anything that is related, anything small and defined and contained, which is related to a sort of totality, related to something very chaotic, very large, and that has a relationship between that smaller thing and this huge, large, chaotic totality, it is subtractive. When you're looking at it from the perspective of the smaller thing, it is subtractive.
So it's actually important to still retain some kind of idea or notion what it is if it is to remain useful. I mean, if it applies to absolutely everything, then its usefulness becomes questionable. But basically, so if we think of that selection in relation to the totality, to what might have been there but isn't, to the consciousness of the fact that we have subtracted something, that would be the way we need to think about subtractive synthesis, I suppose.
Yeah, I think too there is, we can recognize that there are, if we sort of take the same process and apply it to additive synthesis, sort of the opposite, there are, we can observe that there would be things in that metaphorical process that are not subtractive synthesis. I think that when it comes to something creative, the sort of human nature of creating something, the subtractiveness is more common. We look to other things for inspiration. But with these three pieces of music in particular, there is a practical way in which we can recognize the subtractiveness, which is that when you're working with tape as a composer, you know, there is a beginning and an end, and that beginning and an end has to be very intentional. And so I think while we can sort of wax poetic about, you know, Einbahn's ideas that, oh, everything might be subtractive, I think that when it actually comes down to sitting down and creating a piece of audio or creating a piece of music, you have to decide where the beginning and the end is. And that process is definitively subtractive, as opposed to if I was just going to go out into the world, take a 4-hour field recording and just play it as a piece of music, as opposed to me sitting down in the studio, editing it down. And I think we've seen this sort of working with tape ever since, composers like Steve Reich were doing it in the minimalist school, and now we see all sorts of electroacoustic uses in the contemporary sense using it. And so I believe that the practical way in which composers are, I guess now we're using a computer, but you know, to cut a tape and to put it into something is extremely important and very definitively subtractive.
Thank you.
Thank you. And some more questions or comments? Yeah, please. We still have some minutes.
Hello. Your three examples seem to, especially the middle one for Ruth, seem to at least attempt to, from my perspective, maybe circumvent a level of interpretation from the listener, especially like with the liner notes from the middle piece. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on the listener's experience in terms of like the use of field recordings as a more, I guess, quote unquote, like direct way to communicate versus a pure musical, I guess, maybe programmatic or abstract. Like, do you think the listener is benefited from being prescribed the meaning of the piece through direct field recordings or liner notes?
Yeah, that's actually a very good thing to point out. And I first off, I want to make it, I don't want to place the merit of a piece of music on an emotional reaction. And you're absolutely correct. Like reading Anea Lockwood, I don't think that she wrote the liner notes for that. But reading it absolutely does lock you into this, like, all right, this is what I'm listening to, this is what I think. And so I believe that this sort of idea about field recording exists sort of in opposition to, and in contrast to like Pierre Schaeffer's original ideas about the sort of acousmatic sound and wanting to remove what a sound meant from the sound characteristic itself. And I think that there are theories of listening, perhaps that come from people like John Cage or Pauline Oliveros, that would suggest that this way of thinking about field recording is extremely terrible. It's horrible. And you're right. I think that it does remove a level of interpretation. My point in sort of investigating this is to show that if a composer desires to sort of in one particular moment of a piece or throughout a whole piece to lock someone into like, oh, there's something very specific happening right now. The same way that a playwright might write on the stage a specific thing happening or a reference to something very specific, even though it doesn't take over the whole of a composition. But yes, you're absolutely correct in the sense that like this changes the game on interpretation, and to keep interpretation more open, a composer has to balance whether they are forcing a specific situation to happen or whether they are allowing a broader, more abstract, interpretable landscape to exist in their music.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you once again, Murray, for your
thank you so much.
Sharing your thoughts, and we have to proceed. And our last speaker in afternoon session is Beata Juchnevič from Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre, and her presentation. Apologies. Yes, fidget deformation as a compositional strategy, Bacon, the loss, and the turn towards noise.
So, hello everyone. I hope you hear me when I talk like that. So, I pursue a PhD in music composition here, and my main field of research is noise articulation and contemporary classical music. So, I want to create a practical compositional strategy, how to articulate noise, how to structure it. So this is my main research, and this paper was born from it. And it's very, on the one way, it's very abstract and aesthetical, and on the other hand, it's gonna be a little bit practical, just to like practical steps how to compose in such strategy. Wait, sorry, that was the end. Yeah, so the synthesis between painting and music is by no means a novelty. For centuries, composers have drawn inspiration from works of art, a tendency particularly evident from the late 19th century and 20th century, like composers such as Debussy, Mussorgsky, Stravinsky, and many others were inspired by the imagery of paintings, from the narrative content, which often served as the basis for programmatic works, to the general impression of color and atmosphere shaping the sound. And as we heard earlier, our Lithuanian composer Miloš Čiurlionis, being both a painter and a composer himself, encoded musical forms within his paintings and expressed visual imagery through sound in his composition. But the focus of my presentation is not about the synthesis of painting and music, but rather a transference of specific painterly techniques into musical composition, a process in which the act of painting, how the painting is painted, becomes equivalent to the act of composing, turning into a distinct music compositional strategy. And the main inspiration was this book by French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation. While reading it, I could not escape the feeling that the technique of figure deformation in Bacon's paintings is remarkably applicable to musical composition on a structural level. And it's not only applicable, but I apply it in my composition without even knowing it. So that was really a funny thing to discover about myself. So first, it's necessary to clarify what is this technique and how Deleuze defines it. So deformation in general terms, what we find in dictionary, refers to the distortion of a form, a deviation from what is usual or normal. And in the exact sciences, this term relates to empirical solid bodies. Deformation occurs when a body's form is altered due to physical or biological factors, often in a negative direction. Like, for example, if I throw this computer into the wall, it will be deformed. So, yeah. And what it's in painting? Deformation takes a similar shape. The empirical body represented in the image becomes distorted, blurred, or difficult to recognize. And Francis Bacon was quite famous for his treatment of the human body. In his self-portraits and other portraits, like, for example, in this one we see on the screen, he often depicts isolated figures which are deformed through emerging colors and enclosing within dark surrounding spaces. And so this way his paintings pulse with a nervous, visceral energy approaching optical and psychological illusion, depicting wounded and tormented faces. To achieve such imagery, Bacon first painted a clear central figure, which he then distorted through random brush strokes, smearing colors and erasing boundaries between human and animal. And for example, in this self-portrait, which we see on the screen, the contours of a human head blend with a pig. It's suggested by pinkish hues, like we see pink colors, and eyes, big dilated eyes, and blurred snout-like nose. So, but it's not a pig, and it's not a human, it's a third being. What Deleuze called a zone of indiscernibility. This is an unstable state between two poles, neither one nor the other. And according to Deleuze, the deformation of the figure functions as a means to eliminate possible narrative or representational meaning from the artwork. The concrete figure shifts and distorts on a qualitative level. Technically, this occurs by first painting a body, face, or figure, and then stretching, thinning, or otherwise disrupting it through spontaneous nervous gestures. The image becomes a reality of its own and then a reflection of an existing one. And we can clearly see it from Bacon's paintings. I don't know, I can see the technique he used, like he painted the clear image of a head and then violently destroyed it. And what is also important, that the dark matter around it, the background, is not passive. It's not just a passive background. It invades the figure, attempting to consume and overtake it. Like Deleuze wrote, it's an invisible force acting upon the body. And also, it's important to emphasize that deformation and transformation are not identical concepts. While transformation implies that continuous transition from one to another, deformation, it's similar, but deformation is transition to something negative, to something we can't really emphasize anymore. So the process of deformation makes the shape undefined. It becomes incompatible with any other shape. Its lines escaping clarity and merging with uncertainty and fragmented reality. And deformation can be seen not merely as the distortion of a form, but as kind of disbalance, a release of the figure, and through it, a liberation of our own perception. And at this point, what I found interesting, we can draw a parallel with Helmut Leichenmann's composer's notion of liberated perceptions, which he applied in music while composing his Musik concrete instrumentale, and why it's so applicable and seems parallel, because these bodies in painting and figures exist in constant states of flux and fall, where colors intertwine and dissolve object boundaries, freeing our own perception from its habitual conventions. So, these are the tools for deforming figure in painting, just to have clear understanding. Blending of colors, elongation, stretching, or contraction of the body, isolation of the figure within a space that merges with it, dissolution of boundaries between human and animal, creating zone of indiscernibility, and representation of the scream, which in itself deforms the face and the voice. I didn't mention it before, but Deleuze writes a lot about the scream and Bacon's depiction of scream, and it's, I think, the most applicable thing he had told in this book about Bacon's paintings applicable to music, because the scream deforms our voices and deforms sound of an instrument, of any instrument. So, if we imagine sound as an empirical body and the aggregate of sounds as a figure, then by introducing indeterminacy and blurring its clarity, we enact a process analogous to Bacon's deformation. What does such a negative transformation mean? If pitch or harmony constitutes a message, then noise represents the murder of the message. It destroys the message, disrupts, disbalances the message. This idea forms the axis of my presentation. Noise articulation becomes a tool for deforming the sonic figure. What's really interesting, when I read this book, I thought, wow, it's so interesting how we can apply these concepts. And then the whole Pandora box opened in front of me, because I saw that a lot of scholars who research noise on aesthetical level actually applied Deleuze's concept from his study from this particular book, like zone of indiscernibility, becoming animal, and deformation of the figure, to noise aesthetics and how noise and music intertwine. And particularly, Mary Thompson, in her monograph Beyond Unwanted Sound, parallels Deleuze's becoming animal and the third being with the musicalization of noise, like the blurring of boundaries between music and non-music, the pleasant and grotesque. And this way, music blended with noise becomes a third being. It's not music anymore in our conventional sense, but it's still not noise because we hear conventionality in it. And before moving on, I just wanted to briefly revisit what noise is, if someone doesn't know what it is already. So, physically, how Helmholtz described it in 19th century, noise is characterized by non-periodic vibration, like in a dominant harmonic or clear frequency sequence or structure at all. It's just a chaotic mass of energy. And on the aesthetic or metaphysical level, noise has a lot of poetic definitions, which I really love. It's a destruction, pollution, it pollutes music. It's a disorder, chaos, turbulence, how Michel Serres described it. It's dirt. If dirt is something we don't want to see on the ground, for example, then noise is dirt, which we don't want to hear in our music recordings. And this one is really interesting. It's just nausea, like Jean-Paul Sartre wrote. So, what is the actual deformational creative process by Bacon? We can see this is triptych of his paintings, and it clearly shows how his process looks. So he establishes a preliminary image, a central figure, then introduces chaotic forces into the painting through random operations, then studies these disturbances and seeks ways to deform the initial formation, and finally distributes the chaotic forces across the rest of the painting in all partially controlled manner. And I think we already see how we can apply it to musical composition. So we first establish a sonic figure. It can be, I think, a melodic motive, a progression of chords or something like that. Then distort this figure by articulating its noisy potential, often found in timbral gradation, and explore and integrate this deformation meaningfully within the formal process, within the whole structure. And when I was reflecting on compositional practice and how we can apply this process in music, I distinguished two principal models of such deformation. It's narrative and qualitative deformations. Of course, I think it can be filled with a lot more subcategories, but I just wanted to show this one, these two models. So the first one, the narrative deformation. It's not about the programmatic meaning of the piece, but about the whole structure. It's, as I see it, a distortion that unfolds throughout the entire sonic narrative, the entire piece. So yeah, how I mentioned that it's not about programmatic meaning, although it's often emphasize some story of the piece. And structurally, this model functions as an interplay between the figure and the deforming space. I think this is the main point of this kind of deformation, that it happens not in the motif itself, but a space just tries to take over it. And I found this kind of deformation more in electronic music, in works of noise artists. So I will later play this piece, but what I wanted to tell, this is a structure I figured out from this piece. So firstly, the artist establishes the main figure, piano and voice motive. Then this figure changes, so it's transformation but not deformation yet. And then this harmonious drone is gradually consumed by a deforming space of noise. So it's not, this deformation is happening not in this drone, but rather outside of it. The noise is outside of this harmonious drone. And then in the end, the forming space, this noise reaches its peak and takes over this drone. And I have it somewhere here. So we won't listen to everything. I will skip those parts. then somewhere here, the structure evolves. And then the drum itself, harmonious drum. And we can hear those brush strokes of noise outside the drum. Yeah, beautiful music. And in my own compositions, I often employ this model of deformation, and my process mirrors Bacon's technique. I begin with a clear, often minimalistic motive, which is gradually consumed by a deforming space. To achieve this, I divide the instrumental ensemble into the figure and deforming what is the main figure and which instruments deform this figure. In my piece, Lily, for example, a short piano motive serves as the foundation, and as it unfolds, the remaining instruments, flute, saxophone, electric guitar, violin, and violoncello, create a dark space using various noise articulations like timbral noise shadows of the main motive. And then, for example, in section D, the narrative reaches its peak. The main motive is stretched in time within the string parts. We can see that it's still this motive, but it's just really stretched. And other instruments enveloped it with multiphonic chords, diffuse noise textures, and distorted guitar chords. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the funny thing is that I wrote this piece in 2021, long before I even knew about all these concepts, and it's really interesting to find this about myself and about my composition. So we can listen a little bit of this deforming peak. Yes, so whereas the previous model, narrative deformation, relates to interaction of noise and non-noise across the whole form and creating deforming space, which reigns upon the body. The second model, qualitative deformation, concerns the transformation of a single sonic entity, like deformation within the sound, within the body, within the figure itself. This form of deformation is subtler and is typically found in sonorist and spectralist works, where noise functions as a structural element articulating timbral gradation. It's important to recall that noise is an inherent part of every instrument, manifested to varying degrees depending on its construction and playing technique. And the articulation of timbral and dynamic parameters shift the instrument's sound along the noise and pure sound axis, from clarity toward roughness, from order toward disorder, from proximity toward distance. And a clear example can be found in Kaja Sariaho's works, for example, in Petals for Solo Cello. The central axis of this work is the deformation of cello sound through bow overpressure, enhanced by electronic effects that create artificial space and harmonic saturation. At first we hear a clear pitch, then through reverberation and pressure it begins to dissolve in space until the intensified bowing ultimately deforms the tone into near unrecognizability and then gets back to its main figure. And overall, I think the overpressure is perhaps the most effective articulation for deforming string timbres, as it allows continuous gradation along the pure sound and noise axis. And also it represents screaming. The violoncello or violin just starts to scream in this mean. And wind instruments, analogous effects can be achieved by balancing between pure tone and air noise, or between a specific pitch and in an indeterminate multiphonic sonority, and etc. And I think I don't have a lot of time left, so I won't play this example. But I think we can see just from the score that it's just really clear. And yeah, these are conclusions, but I won't say it out loud because I think everything is clear now. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Beata, for sharing your insights, and it was fascinating to see how your aesthetics is placed into wider philosophical and artistical context, and of course Deleuzean philosophy is very suitable for that. Some comments or questions, as always, welcome.
I wanted to know what's the relationship between deformation and destruction. Are they treated the same, or is there a difference between those concepts?
In Deleuze's book or in my mind?
From you.
In my mind, I think they are kind of the same, because destruction destroys something, deformation deforms. So in means of noise, noise destructs and deforms. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beata. It was really interesting. Deleuze's philosophy is, as you say, Pandora's box, but it's so convenient for defining many things in music, and this deformation and destruction, I get this, but I think there is much more to noise, and which can also be explained in the light of Deleuzian philosophy. When you talk about deformation, there's obviously noise is dependent on like conventional structures, on motives, on pitches, on rhythms, and it deforms it. It adds this kind of qualitative layer. But when you talk about destruction, and this example of Sarajevo, I don't remember this piece very well, but when you have a single note and you destroy it with the noise, it's not the same as you would destroy or deform a motive, because a single note is a quality. It does not have any kind of dialectical meaning. So it has a kind of different structural potentials than deforming motive. I don't know if I sound cohesive, but yeah, there's a lot of possibilities how to analyze sound, noise, and various kind of timbres in Deleuzian way, and applying concept of rhizome is one of possible keys. So it's a very interesting talk you gave, and I really liked it. So I wish you good luck in your further investigations of this Pandora's box.
Thank you.
Sorry, were you trying to answer?
It wasn't a question.
I wonder, how do you see the relationship between noise and another concept very important for some of Deleuze's writings, but you mentioned it somehow in passing, and that is chaos.
Can you repeat the question? I lost myself.
Can you say something about the way you see relations between noise and chaos?
Okay. So, as much as I read a lot of aesthetic researches about noise, because first whole chapter of my PhD thesis is about the aesthetical approach to noise. Noise is a chaos. Noise is a chaotical force, because in itself it doesn't have any clarity unless we put clarity in it, but noise is a chaos.
Okay, because we can define both concepts in various ways. Actually, Deleuze writes in this study about Bacon about the way various artists engage with chaos. I mentioned Mondrian, who codifies chaos, and then there's abstract impressionism, whatever his name was, abstract expressionists, American. Jackson Pollock, of course. And Bacon, and how he plunges directly into chaos. I think it would be useful to distinguish between these. Chaos is the origin. That we're getting into ontological question, not a disorder, but a plethora of orders. Orders superimposed upon one another, and out of that virtual, intensive chaos, certain beings emerge, crystallize, and that's the chaos. Okay, we cannot go now into details. But I think that noise perhaps comes as an intrusion of chaos into that, or as some kind of force which opens the work for chaos to pour into, or like a sieve over chaos. That's another expression that they use. So perhaps just a food for thought. If I may suggest something, these Bacon's screaming popes, I think it would be very effective to put it alongside Velázquez's portraits of the Pope to see how deformation works. I think that would be a marvelous thing to see in one slide.
Okay.
I have just a simple question at the very end of our session. Just that what came into my mind could be silence interpreted as a noise in connection with musical elements.
The question is there any silence at all?
Yes, it might be, but what we perceive as a silence, or making you can perceive like and nothing.
I don't know. Yeah.
Because of clarity and fusion, there are some elements to, even with a very clear elements, we could create like chaos that is actually not chaos.
Yes.
But in our perception, the fusion of elements might became as an element of quasi noise, let's say, and that in considering that dimension, maybe even silence could be interpreted in the same level, like fusion, like nothing, like everything.
Actually, that was a very good remark from Martins. You know, what is my impression? If we something identify as chaos, if we identify something as something, it does not affect us in a way kind of profound, strange, which destabilize everything. I mean that in some tonal music, even some strange harmony which appears, strange motion which appears in kind of predictable clarity, it can function much more powerfully as a sign of chaos than kind of evident chaos which is shown. Look, this is chaos. We identified it. You understand my point?
Yeah.
Our point.
Yeah.
You know, everything is defined too clearly. Everything is explained too clearly. And when it loses interest, it loses mystery, to my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think Miloš also wanted to say something similar, no? Yeah.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk and everything you had to say about Bacon. I'm a composer myself, and he's a painter whose work has really influenced me. I'm always disturbed by the idea that the work is about deformation, though. I've read the Deleuze book as well, of course, but if you read the interviews with Bacon, he was much more interested in capturing something. And the processes he used were to do with what he called capturing the reality of an image. I was talking about this myself on Friday because I'm giving a talk that relates to this. But it's not really about deformation as such. I think it's about trying to capture something through an image. Have you read the interviews with him at all, with Bacon?
I read it, but I just wanted to concentrate my point of view on deformation, not what Bacon would say or something like that, but for me, this captured my attention, the figure deformation, and I saw potential just to transcribe it into a composing process, and that's all.
Sure, I mean, that's everybody's reaction to the painting is different, and it's really
Yes.
interesting what you had to say about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, dear colleagues, thank you for your active participation. We had inspiring session. And so it's time to rest, to have dinner, and don't forget tonight at 7:00 p.m. there is a concert in another place, Organum. music hall. And so local people will help you to find that place. At 7 o'clock, the concert is waiting. So thank you for today, and wish you, yes, inspiring tomorrow.